Hello! Today on the History Project show, we'll be exploring how women's roles were more prominent in the 1920s society. Before the 1920s, women's roles were much more conservative. Women spent more time doing housework rather than being active citizens of America. But after World War I, women's roles changed for the better by having the right to vote politically, more job opportunities, and socially because they acted more extravagantly rather than conservatively.
So many political rights came together for women in the 1920s. It was a positive change for women. For example, the most important right was the right to vote. Women's suffrage groups had been fighting since 1848 for their rights. It all started with Jeannette Rankin's entry into Congress. The view on women's rights changed in those 70 years. That change is shown in the 1920s. With women who followed after Rankin in office, it wasn't an easy job. It seemed to be a Herculean task for them to continue fighting for women's rights, especially with the poor amount of them holding a position in office. Now, talking about when women got the right to vote. The voter participation rate decreased because women were scared to be judged when voting. The other issue with the voter participation rate decreasing was due to the argument between affiliated parties. That was due to women not voting individually, but what their husbands would vote. With women having the right to vote, it still wasn't enough for women to be seen as equal. They were viewed as individuals, but feminism became a characteristic for women which wasn't seen as good. Later on, the ERA was introduced. ERA stands for the Equal Rights Amendment. The ERA was introduced by the National Women's Party in 1923, but another group opposed of the ERA, so it wasn't passed till later. Although it wasn't passed right away, it was still a step forward for women equality. In the 1920s, women targeted social welfare to move forward into politics. Although it was rare, women worked their way into office in the 1920s. A total of 7 were elected into the House of Representatives in 1928. That was a big achievement, and they had greater success in state politics. Racism played a big part in women's progression in politics. A lot of people didn't allow forward movement because African Americans were excluded from most women's suffrage groups. In 1929, they began their improvement to political equality. In the end, this was a very hard journey for women, but they wouldn't give up, and decades later, what they all wanted became a reality. The way they worked hard was a success. Women made a positive leap in politics.
Before war, women's life tended to center around farm and family. Women worked inside the house transforming raw products into usable commodities. Women swept, scrubbed, polished, made their own brooms, and made both the soap and polish that they themselves would use. They sewed and made everything and were usually also in charge of bookkeeping. Women also kept their own gardens and every fall canned and preserved vast amounts of homegrown fruits and vegetables. But then, war came along and changed most of that. After the war, women were given way more job opportunities. Many women began working side by side with their spouses. Nearly 3 million new women workers were employed in food, textile, and war industries. There had been many taboos and restrictions thrown up to keep women out of large-scale production industries. But after war, and even during war, they were broken down. Women could now work as streetcar conductors, radio operators, and in steel mills and logging camps during the war. Women had been working long hours to provide whatever support that was needed. The roles of women began to change rapidly because of the war. Women had to help to support the war while maintaining their household. During this time, women learned many new skills, and as a result, their roles were continuing to change. During World War I, the labor force of women expanded to almost 3 million. As men went off to war, women were given more responsibilities. About 20,000 women were working for the military. Factories that had produced merchandise such as coats, suits, and other garments began to make uniforms for soldiers. Women were taking over the production lines in factories. Some women were becoming soldiers in America. Women were forced to take on new roles. They needed to replace men who left for the battlefield. Women were working long hours making ammunition and guns, and some were working in government jobs such as clerks and managers. Women were becoming independent, all on their own. Women didn't need the knowledge of men to learn the new skills. They learned them all on their own, and because of this, women were given way more job opportunities.
After World War I, there were many dramatic changes in women's fashion. One example of this was the discontinued use of corsets. Instead, dresses were much lighter due to the use of less material and new synthetic fabrics. Also, the dresses were of very vibrant colors, featuring different textures and patterns, which differed considerably from the conservative ones from earlier decades. But the most scandalous difference was perhaps the fact that the dresses were shorter than ever before. Consequently, shoes and stockings were of greater importance since they were much more visible. Evening dresses, coats, and jackets also grew in popularity and were often trimmed with fur. Another change that came with this was the expansion of mail-order catalogs, which meant one could buy fashionable clothes even without a department store in town. This opened doors to country people to access city fashions for the first time ever. Women's hairstyles also went through dramatic change, as the bob was reintroduced by actress Louise Brooks in the late 1920s. This short haircut, along with curls or waves, defined the new woman of the 1920s. Another factor in the physical appearance of women at the time was the increased use of makeup, especially the use of bold, dramatic colors. In addition to the change in appearance for women in the 1920s, there was also a change in dancing. Since women were free from the restrictions in movement that came with corsets and large puffed sleeves, they were able to dance around more freely, allowing for new dance moves such as swaying, hugging, and grinding. Examples of these dances include the waltz and tango. Such dances were thought of as scandalous since this was a radical change from the conservative way of dancing because they involved physical contact between partners. All of these changes contributed to the more prominent role of women in society because it helped them to get out of their comfort zones and enter a new world in which they would grow to be known as a new woman. They all did their part in making women of the 1920s more outgoing and involved in their society as they got out of the house and into a whole new world of opportunities.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back. I hope you got something out of it because I know our show/production crew worked really hard to put the show together. And I'm sure the women of the 1920s would be very proud. So when you see a woman next time, be like, they went through a lot just to get through where they at. So appreciate women every day of their lives. Everyone have a good night.